The brass handle was cold, radiating a chill that matched the atmosphere of the Grimshaw estate. Lorelei's knuckles were white as she clutched her purse, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For 12 months, she had been a shadow in sensible wool and forgettable sweaters. Tonight, the crimson silk felt like a second skin, daring, expensive, and loud. "Where do you think you're going dressed like that?" The voice didn't just break the silence, it sliced through it. Lorelei froze. Silas Grimshaw stood at the end of the marble hallway, the security lights outside casting his silhouette long and jagged across the floor. He looked unpolished, hair damp from a shower, white sleeves rolled to his elbows, the geometric ink on his forearms looking like jagged scars in the low light. He had never closed the distance between them before. Not once. But as he stepped into the warmth of the hallway lights, his gaze traveled down the curve of her bare shoulder to the high slit of the dress, and back up. The air became too thin to breathe. He wasn't looking at his maid. He was looking at a woman he had no intention of letting go. "Hello, my beautiful family. I am so glad you are here with me today. Before we begin, I just want to check in. I hope your day has been kind to you. And if it hasn't, I hope this space gives you a little peace and a chance to breathe. If this is your first time here, welcome home. You are already part of the family. Please like and subscribe, it is truly the only reason these stories get to come to life. And drop a hello in the comments, tell us where you are watching from. I love seeing where our family reaches. Now, today's story. I need you to be ready for this one. A woman who spent a whole year invisible, head down, sensible clothes, saving every penny, asking for nothing. One night off. One red dress. One hallway. And a man who had been watching her the entire time, who stopped her at the door and made it very clear she was not going anywhere. Slow burn. Tension you can feel through the screen. And a love story that nobody in that house saw coming. Get comfortable. Grab something to snack on. Let go of the day. And let's step into this together. She had learned to move like water. Not gracefully, that was the wrong word for what she had become. Water didn't need to be graceful. It simply found the path of least resistance, slipping through cracks, filling the spaces no one bothered to look at, disappearing the moment the light hit it wrong. That was Lorelei Finch at 24 years old. That was Lorelei Finch for 365 days inside the cold, marble-boned body of Grimshaw Estate. The position had not been her first choice. It had not even been her 10th. She had applied to 14 jobs in the span of 2 weeks, a receptionist post at a shipping firm in Canary Wharf, a data entry role she was overqualified for, a front desk position at a hotel that smelled of mildew and false promises. She had been turned down by 12 of them and ghosted by 2 more. Her bank account at the time had held £47 and a transaction history that read like a map of small disasters. So when the agency called with the Grimshaw placement, she had not asked the questions she should have asked. She had simply said yes, packed her one good suitcase, and arrived at the gate of an estate that looked more like a private institution than a home. The housekeeper who hired her on the agency's referral, a compact, efficient woman named Mrs. Dallow who wore her gray hair scraped back with military precision, had given her the rules in a single, unbroken monologue that lasted 11 minutes. Lorelei had counted. There were to be no personal items left in common areas. No use of the main staircase before 8 in the morning. No conversation with Mr. Grimshaw unless he initiated it, and even then, responses were to be brief, professional, and forgettable. Meals for staff were taken in the kitchen annex. Her room was on the 3rd floor, east wing, and the window faced a courtyard that never seemed to catch the sun. She had nodded through all of it with the smile she kept specifically for occasions when she needed people to believe she was absolutely fine. The work itself was not difficult. Lorelei was methodical by nature, precise in the way that people become precise when carelessness has cost them something real. She pressed shirts until the placket lay flat as a blade. She arranged the shelves in the study with the spines of the books perfectly flush, not because anyone had asked her to but because crooked spines made her chest feel tight. She learned which rooms Silas used and which rooms he passed through like a cold front, briefly, efficiently, leaving the air slightly changed in his wake. The library at midnight. The kitchen at 6 in the morning, never for more than 4 minutes, always black coffee, never a word. The ground floor study on Thursdays, where the low murmur of voices through the closed door told her that whoever visited him on those evenings did not use the front entrance. She did not ask about those voices. She was not paid to ask. She was paid to be invisible, and she was very, very good at it. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came not from hard work but from sustained smallness. From keeping yourself consistently below the threshold of notice. From training your footsteps to be soft and your presence to be negative space. Lorelei felt it in the evenings most sharply, when she would sit on the edge of her narrow bed with its scratchy institution standard duvet and do the arithmetic that had become her only real ritual. She kept a small notebook, pale blue, the kind sold in stacks of 3 at newsagents, and every fortnight she would write down the new total of what she had saved. Crossed it out. Rewrote it. As though seeing the number twice made it more real, more solid, more like a door she was actually moving toward rather than a door she was simply dreaming about. The number she needed was £42,000. That was what her brother Owen owed. That was the weight that sat on the family name like a stone tied to a neck, the debt their father had run up before his heart stopped and left them to carry it. Owen was 21 and fragile in ways he would never admit, and the men who held the debt were not the kind who sent polite reminders. They sent other things. Once, a photograph. Once, a car idling outside Owen's flat for 4 hours on a Tuesday night. The message in both cases was the same: we are patient, but we are not infinite. So Lorelei made herself small and saved her money and did not think too hard about the fact that working in the orbit of a man like Silas Grimshaw to escape the orbit of men like Silas Grimshaw was the particular kind of irony that life reserved for people who had no better options. She bought the dress in February. It was an accident, the way certain necessary things are accidents, the product of a wrong turn and a moment of weakness and a shop window that caught her at precisely the wrong hour. She had been on her half-day off, walking the long route back from the pharmacy where she collected Owen's prescription, and the dress had been there in the glass like something that had wandered in from another life. Crimson silk. The cut of it architectural, almost severe, with a plunging back and a slit that started at the mid-thigh. The kind of dress that did not ask for permission. She went inside intending to look. She came out with a bag that cost her slightly more than she had allotted herself for the month and a feeling in her sternum that was embarrassingly close to joy. She told herself it was an investment. She told herself she would wear it on the day she handed over the final envelope to Owen, when the debt was cleared and the photograph became just a photograph and the idling car became just a car. She would wear it then. She would wear it to whatever small restaurant they could afford and she would drink something with bubbles in it and she would feel, for one evening, like a person who had always been exactly as visible as she chose to be. She kept it in the zip bag it came in, pushed to the back of the wardrobe, behind her work uniforms. She did not look at it for 4 months. And then March became June, became October, became the brittle lip of winter again, and she was still pressing shirts and still eating in the kitchen annex and still walking past Silas Grimshaw in corridors where he never once paused to note that she existed. And the notebook showed a number that was promising but not yet enough. And Owen had called her on a Thursday evening sounding like he was holding something very tightly together with both hands, and when she hung up the phone she had stood in her room for a long time looking at the wardrobe. She had taken the dress out just to hold it. That was all she'd meant to do. But the silk had that particular weight to it, cool and substantial, the weight of something that knew its own worth, and before she had made a conscious decision she was stepping into it, pulling the side zipper up, and turning to face the small rectangle of mirror above the dresser. She had looked at her own reflection for a long time. The woman who looked back at her was not a shadow. She was not sensible wool or a forgettable sweater. She had a high sharp ponytail and full dark bangs and a jawline that the dress somehow made architectural. She had bare shoulders and an expression she hadn't seen on her own face in so long it took her a moment to name it. She looked like someone who was not afraid of being seen. She had worn the dress down the stairs with her purse in her hand and her heart in her throat, and she had not made it to the door. He didn't move toward her immediately. That was the thing she would remember afterward, in the privacy of her room with the dress back in its zip bag and her hand still not entirely steady. He didn't rush. He didn't startle or fumble or reach for the professional remove that employers used when they accidentally encountered staff after hours. He simply stood at the end of the marble hallway and looked at her with the particular stillness of a man who had never once in his life been caught off guard, and who would not be starting tonight. "Where do you think you're going dressed like that?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Lorelei's fingers tightened on the strap of her purse. She made herself breathe. She made herself stand straight, which was harder than it should have been because every instinct she had spent 12 months carefully cultivating was screaming at her to shrink, to fold herself back into the acceptable dimensions of invisible, to apologize, to become forgettable again with the speed of someone who had practiced it into reflex. She did not shrink. "Out," she said. The word came out steadier than she felt. One syllable. Brief, professional, and not quite forgettable. Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it in the low light. The hallway was lit only by the amber wash of the wall sconces, and the shadows sat deep in the hollows of his features, making him look less like her employer and more like the thing her employer used to frighten other men. He had always been large in the way that certain men were large, not with excess but with density, as though he simply occupied more of the world's matter than other people were allocated. Tonight, without the armor of his tailoring, without the dark structured jacket and the pressed collar that usually kept him contained within the acceptable geometry of a powerful man going about his powerful business, he seemed larger still. The white shirt was soft with washing, untucked on one side, the sleeves pushed to the elbows in a way that looked unplanned. The ink on his forearms caught the amber light. Geometric shapes, precise and interlocking, that she had glimpsed perhaps twice in a year and never allowed herself to look at directly. She was looking at them now. "Out," he repeated. Not mocking. More like he was testing the word, turning it over, finding it insufficient. He took one step forward, and the geometry of the hallway shifted. The distance between them went from abstract to measurable. "That tells me nothing, Miss Finch." Miss Finch. He knew her name. She had not been entirely certain he knew her name. "It's my evening off," she said. She kept her chin level. Her heart was doing something complicated and unhelpful inside her chest. "Mrs. Dallow confirmed it last Tuesday. I'm not scheduled until 7 tomorrow morning." "I'm aware of your schedule." The way he said it gave her pause. Quiet and matter-of-fact, the way he might confirm a business detail. As though her schedule were something he had cause to know. She filed that away behind the part of her brain that was still trying to manage the situation rationally and told herself to examine it later, when there was more air in the room. He took another step. She held her ground. He was close enough now that she could see the damp at his temples where his hair hadn't fully dried, close enough to see that the collar of his shirt was open by 2 buttons and the geometric ink didn't stop at his forearms. Close enough that she became aware, with a sudden and inconvenient clarity, that he had stopped moving not because he had reached a polite distance but because he had reached something else, the outer edge of her perfume. She watched him pause. It was a barely perceptible thing, a fraction of a second's stillness that she might have missed if she hadn't been watching him with every frayed nerve she had. His nostrils moved slightly. His jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with displeasure, or at least not the kind of displeasure she recognized. The perfume was expensive, more expensive than she could comfortably justify, a birthday gift to herself from 3 months ago, something with white gardenia and amber and something darker underneath she couldn't name but that the woman at the counter had called presents. Lorelei had bought it because it smelled like the version of herself that didn't eat in kitchen annexes. She wore it rarely. She was wearing it tonight because tonight was supposed to be hers. Silas said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her bare shoulder with an expression that had left the territory of employer entirely and had not yet declared where it was going. "Who are you meeting?" The question was quiet. That was somehow worse than if he'd demanded it. Quiet meant considered. Quiet meant he had already decided this was information he was entitled to. "Someone personal," she said. "That's not an answer. It's not a question you're owed." The silence that followed that sentence was the longest 4 seconds of her professional life. She saw something shift in his expression, a fractional recalibration, the way a very controlled person absorbs a surprise without letting it become visible. His eyes, which were a dark gray that she had never been close enough to confirm until this precise moment, moved from her shoulder to her face. "You've worked in my house for a year," he said, "and I have never heard you use that tone. You've never given me reason to." Another silence. Shorter this time. Something in it felt different, less like the pause before a reprimand and more like the pause before a decision. "Is it a man?" The question hit her somewhere between offense and a peculiar, unwanted warmth that she refused to examine. She kept her expression level. "That's considerably less your business than the first question." His gaze dropped again, not slowly, not salaciously, but with the focused deliberateness of a man conducting an assessment he had already decided to be honest about. The slit of the dress. The line of her collarbone. The small gold hoop in her left ear that she wore only on evenings that belonged to her. Back up. The kind of inventory that took 3 seconds and left her feeling like she had been entirely read. "You bought that dress to be seen," he said. Flat. Observational. As though he were simply confirming a fact they both already knew. Her throat tightened. "I bought that dress for myself. Those aren't mutually exclusive." She had no answer for that. The gardenia in her perfume seemed suddenly louder in the small climate between them, the amber note underneath it rising in the warmth of the hallway like something she hadn't intended to say out loud. She watched him breathe it in again, deliberately this time, not pretending otherwise, and the expression on his face did something that she did not have a professional category for. "You're not leaving," he said. Not a question. Not a request. Just a sentence assembled from quiet certainty, the kind that men like Silas Grimshaw apparently constructed the way other people constructed furniture, load-bearing, fitted, and intended to last. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "Not yet." He looked at the door behind her, then back at her face, with the air of a man deciding something he had perhaps been deciding for longer than tonight. "Come with me, Miss Finch." He turned and walked back down the hallway toward the study. He did not look back to check if she was following. He walked the way he did everything, as though the outcome had already been determined and the present moment was simply the formality of it catching up. She stood at the door with her hand still on the cold brass handle. The night outside was dark and waiting. Behind her, the amber light of the sconces threw his shadow long and certain down the marble corridor. Her fingers loosened on the handle. She followed him. She had been in the study before. That was the thing she kept returning to as she crossed the threshold behind him, the small, grounding fact that this room was not unknown to her. She had dusted the shelves in here on Monday mornings, had straightened the stacks of folders that appeared and disappeared from the mahogany desk with a regularity that suggested Silas worked in cycles of intense accumulation and total erasure. She had replaced the whiskey decanter twice, had run a cloth along the spines of the books that lined the east wall, books that were not decorative, she had noted, because their spines were creased with genuine use. She knew this room. She had been alone in it dozens of times. It was an entirely different room with him in it. He moved to the far side of the desk without turning on the overhead light, which meant the room existed now only in the amber pool thrown by the single lamp on the desk's corner and the thin wash of silver coming through the tall window from whatever cold sky sat above the estate tonight. The effect was not accidental. Lorelei was beginning to understand that very little Silas Grimshaw did was accidental. He did not sit. He stood behind the desk with one hand resting on its surface, fingers loose, and looked at her across the dark geography of mahogany and shadow and the distance she was trying very hard to maintain. She had stopped 3 feet inside the doorway. She told herself it was practical, she was closer to the exit this way. She did not examine the other reasons too carefully. "Close the door," he said. She considered not doing it. The rebellion lasted approximately 2 seconds before she reached back and pushed it shut, because she was 24 years old and owed £42,000 in proxy, and this man had not given her a single legitimate reason to be reckless, and the part of her brain that handled survival was still, just barely, louder than the part that was noting the particular quality of his attention. The latch clicked. The room contracted. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." He looked at her for a moment without expression. Then he reached for the decanter on the desk, the good one, Crystal, that she had replaced in November, and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass. He did not pour a second glass. He set the first one on the near edge of the desk, closest to her, and then straightened and looked at her with the patience of someone who had negotiated things considerably more resistant than a maid in a red dress. She did not touch the glass. She also did not move away from it. "Who is he?" Silas said. "I've already told you that's not my business." He said it with her, not unkindly, as though he had memorized the sentence and was simply completing it for efficiency. "You mentioned that." "I'm asking anyway." "Then you're wasting your time. I have a great deal of it tonight." He picked up his own glass, she hadn't seen him pour it, and held it without drinking, turning it slightly in his fingers. The lamplight moved through the whiskey like something living. "His name." "No." The word was out before she could moderate it. Clean and hard-edged, the way certain words came out when the body bypassed the brain's editorial process entirely. She watched it land. He absorbed it the same way he'd absorbed everything tonight, without visible impact, like something built to withstand pressure and completely aware of the fact. "You're protecting him," Silas said. Not an accusation. An observation, offered in the same tone he might use to read a weather report. "I'm protecting my private life, which is something I'm entitled to regardless of who signs my paycheck." She kept her voice even. She was proud of how even she kept her voice. "I have a night off. I had plans. You've detained me in your study without cause, and I would like to leave." "Detained." He said the word as though trying its weight. "That's a strong choice." "It's an accurate one." He set his glass down. He moved then, not toward her, which was what every alarmed instinct she had was bracing for, but around the side of the desk, slowly, the way he had moved down the hallway. Unhurried. As though urgency were a concept he had simply opted out of. He stopped at the corner of the desk, which put him neither behind it nor fully in front of it but at its edge, and crossed his arms, and looked at her from perhaps 6 feet away with an expression she was running out of professional categories for. "Tell me something," he said. His voice had changed slightly. Lower. The boardroom quality had shed one of its layers, the way the hallway had shed his jacket, the way the evening had shed the ordinary rules of their arrangement one by one until she was standing in a room that barely resembled the one she worked in. "In 12 months, have I ever given you reason to believe you weren't safe in this house?" The question surprised her. She had been prepared for pressure, for the particular brand of entitled insistence that powerful men applied to things they wanted. She had not been prepared for that. "No," she said, after a moment that was more honest than strategic. "Then extend me the same assumption." His eyes held hers without effort, without the performance of intensity that lesser men used when they wanted to appear serious. His was simply the natural state of a man who had never needed to perform anything because the reality of him was already sufficient. "I'm not asking to be unreasonable. I'm asking because someone is expecting you tonight, and I don't know who that someone is, and I find I am not comfortable with that." The confession, if it could be called that, arrived in the room so quietly that she almost missed its nature. She turned it over. He found he was not comfortable. Not we have a security protocol, not staff movements after hours require disclosure, not any of the legitimate professional frameworks he could have reached for. He found he was not comfortable. Personal. Deliberate. Placed in the open between them like a card set face up on a table by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She felt the room tilt very slightly. "Why?" she asked. The word came out quieter than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight sat in the sharp line of his jaw and the gray of his eyes and the ink at his forearms where his sleeves were still pushed up, and outside the window the cold sky over the estate was doing nothing to help her maintain the appropriate orientation to this situation. "You've been in this house for a year," he said. "You have never asked me for anything. You have never been late. You have never complained, never taken more than you were allocated, never made yourself known in any way that wasn't strictly necessary." He paused. "And tonight you put on a dress that cost more than your weekly wage and you walked toward my front door at 9 in the evening with your jaw set like you were walking towards something you'd been waiting a long time for." She couldn't breathe properly. "I noticed," he said simply. As though that were all. As though that explained and excused and complicated everything simultaneously, which it did. The whiskey glass sat untouched on the corner of the desk. The lamp threw its amber circle across the dark floor between them. She was still 3 feet from the door and he was 6 feet from her, and the distance felt at once too much and entirely insufficient, a measurement that no longer meant what measurements usually meant. "His name is Owen," she said. The words came out before she had fully decided to say them, loosened by something she hadn't anticipated, the simple, disorienting experience of being seen by the one person she had spent a year successfully hiding from. "He's my brother." Silas went very still. She watched something move behind his eyes, rapid, internal, the visible surface of a calculation she wasn't privy to. His arms, still crossed, tightened fractionally. His jaw did a thing she couldn't fully read, but that made the temperature in the room feel like it had dropped by 2 degrees. "Your brother," he said. "Yes." Another silence. This one had a different texture entirely. She had given him something and he was taking it somewhere she couldn't follow, and the careful, controlled expression on his face had developed a quality that she could only describe, inadequately, as the look of a man who has just reclassified a problem and does not entirely like the new category it falls into. "How old is Owen?" he asked. She frowned. 21. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He reached for his glass and drank from it, unhurried, and when he set it down he looked at her with eyes that were doing something complicated and private and entirely focused on her face. "Sit down, Miss Finch," he said again. Softer this time. Not a command with edges. Something closer to a request from a man who didn't make many of them. "I think," he added, with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing each word like a stone to step on across dark water, "that you and I need to have a conversation that has nothing to do with your employment contract." She sat down. She hadn't planned to. The decision happened somewhere below the level of conscious choice, in the part of her that had been standing at attention for 12 months straight and recognized, with a bone-deep exhaustion it hadn't been permitted to acknowledge until now, that the man across the desk was not going to let this go. Not tonight. Not with that expression on his face, the one that had shed its last layer of professional distance and replaced it with something she had no framework for, because in a year of careful observation she had never once seen Silas Grimshaw look at anything the way he was currently looking at her. Like it mattered what she said next. She sat in the chair across from the desk, not the chair directly in front of it, the obvious supplicant's position, but the one angled slightly to the side, a small and probably transparent assertion of the fact that she was here by something approaching choice. The crimson silk pooled against the dark leather. She set her purse in her lap and kept both hands on it and looked at him. He had moved back behind the desk. She understood, dimly, that this was a concession, that the desk between them was something he was offering her, a geometry of safety she hadn't asked for but that he had apparently decided she needed. It did not make her feel less watched. Nothing about Silas Grimshaw suggested that a piece of mahogany furniture was going to meaningfully interrupt his attention. "Tell me about Owen," he said. "Not tell me about the debt. Not tell me why your brother requires a clandestine meeting at 9 in the evening. Just the name." Offered back to her like an opening, like a door held ajar. She looked at her hands on the purse. She thought about the pale blue notebook in her wardrobe upstairs and the number she'd crossed out and rewritten twice last fortnight. She thought about the photograph, the one that had arrived in an unmarked envelope at Owen's flat 8 months ago, a picture of him leaving his building, taken from a distance that implied patience and resources. She thought about the phone call last Thursday, his voice stretched thin over the line, holding itself together with both hands. She told him. Not everything. Not the full depth and geography of it. She was not yet in a position to give Silas Grimshaw the complete map of her vulnerabilities. Some surviving instinct of self-preservation held that much back. But she told him the shape of it. Their father's debts, accumulated over the last 4 years of a life lived at a reckless tilt, handed down at his death like a poisoned inheritance. The men who held the debt, she did not know their names, she had only descriptions, only the second-hand information Owen passed along in pieces small enough that he could pretend it wasn't as serious as it was. The photograph. The car outside the flat. Owen's increasingly brief and carefully controlled phone calls that told her, in everything they didn't say, that the patience of the men in question was approaching its natural limit. She told him that she had been saving. She told him the number she was working toward. She told him that tonight she was supposed to deliver the latest installment, not the full amount, not yet, but enough to buy Owen another 6 weeks of the patience running out more slowly. She did not tell him that she had been doing this from inside his house. That the money she was saving was his money. That every pressed shirt and replaced decanter and Monday morning dust cloth had been a small stone laid on the path toward a door that had nothing to do with the Grimshaw estate. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Silas had not moved while she spoke. He sat with his forearms on the desk and his hands loosely linked and his eyes on her face with an attention so complete and so still that she had the unsettling experience of feeling both examined and, paradoxically, steadied. As though being fully seen by something that did not flinch was its own strange form of solid ground. He said nothing for long enough that she began to regret the telling. Began to mentally catalogue which parts of the story she could retract, recategorize, dilute into something more manageable. Then he said, very quietly, "What are their names?" She blinked. "I told you, I don't. Owen's names for them." "What does he call them?" She hesitated. "He mentioned a carver. Once. He said it by accident and then spent the rest of the call trying to make me forget he'd said it." Something happened in Silas's face. It was the subtlest shift she had witnessed yet, a compression, a drawing inward, a quality that entered his eyes from some interior room she was not meant to access. He looked, for a fraction of a second, the way a very controlled person looks when they receive information that matters in a way they had not anticipated and are immediately, efficiently, and completely recalibrating around it. "Carver," he said. "You know him." It was not a question. His face had already answered it. He looked at her for a moment with the considered quiet of someone deciding how much of the truth was navigable in the current terrain. "I know of him," he said. "And that is already more than you should." The way he said it changed the temperature of the room. Not the warmth of it, the nature of it. Something had entered the air that had not been there before, a density, a quality of seriousness that made the previous tension feel, in retrospect, almost social. She watched his linked hands tighten, just slightly. Watched the muscle in his jaw do something deliberate and contained. "The money you were taking Owen tonight," he said. "How were you delivering it?" "A drop point. A locker at Waterloo." Owen sends me the code the morning of. She paused. He'll be waiting for confirmation that it was done. Call him. What? Call your brother. His voice had not risen. It had done something more authoritative than rising. It had simplified, shed its remaining social register and arrived at a register she had no name for except the obvious one, the register of a man who was accustomed to being the last word in a room. Tell him the drop is delayed. Tonight only. Tell him you're safe. She stared at him. You're not letting me go. No. Flat. Certain. Not cruel. Not to a Carver drop point. Not tonight. Not in that dress and not in any other. You can't. Lorelei. Her name. Her first name, which he had never used, not once in 12 months, and the effect of it in his voice in this room in this light was so profoundly disorienting that whatever she had been about to say dissolved entirely before it reached her mouth. He looked at her with those dark gray eyes that were doing something she absolutely refused to name. I am not telling you this because you work for me. I am telling you this because Carver's people do not use lockers at Waterloo for goodwill exchanges. They use them for documentation. They use them to establish patterns. He paused, and the pause had weight. If Owen has been making regular drops at their designated points, they already have everything they need to own him. The money is incidental. The room went cold around her. She had known the situation was serious. She had known it the way people know things they are managing rather than confronting, held at the precise distance required to keep functioning. But there was a profound difference between knowing something at management distance and having it confirmed by a man who spoke about it with the authority of someone for whom this was not abstract. For whom this was, in fact, native terrain. How do you know that? She asked. Her voice had lost some of its steadiness. She noticed but couldn't correct it. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight sat in the angles of his face. Outside, the estate was silent in the way that large, secured properties were silent, completely, artificially, like silence that had been arranged. Because, he said, with a quietness that was the most frightening thing she had heard all evening, it is what I would do. She looked at him across the desk. At the geometric ink on his forearms. At the open collar and the dark eyes and the particular stillness of a man who had just, without theatrics or apology, told her exactly what he was. Her purse was in her lap. The door was behind her. The distance between where she sat and the cold brass handle of the front door was approximately 40 feet of marble corridor. She did not move. Call Owen, Silas said again. Softer now. Something in it that was almost, not gentle, that was the wrong word for anything in this man's register, but considered. Careful with her, in the way that very powerful things were occasionally careful with smaller ones. Not from weakness. From awareness of the disparity. Tell him you're safe. Tell him to stay inside tonight. Tell him, he added, and something moved across his face that she filed away to examine later, when she had enough air to think clearly, that someone is looking into it. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. 4. The kind of eye contact that stopped being a standoff and became something else, something without a clean professional label, somewhere around the 3rd second. Then she reached into her purse and took out her phone. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She knew because she watched the timer on her phone screen with the focused attention of someone who needed a number to look at, something countable, something that behaved according to known rules, while everything else in the room declined to do so. Owen picked up on the 2nd ring, which meant he had been waiting. Which meant the evening had been as real to him as it had been to her, and the thought of that sat behind her sternum like something with too many edges. She kept her voice even. She told him the drop was delayed. She told him she was fine, she was safe, something had come up, she would explain when she could. She did not look at Silas while she said these things. She was aware of him the way she was aware of a fire in a room, not by looking directly at it but by the heat it displaced, the way it reorganized all the air around itself without moving. Owen asked 2 questions. She answered them both with versions of the truth that were accurate enough to be believed and incomplete enough to avoid the conversation she did not have the capacity for tonight. She told him to stay inside. She told him, with the careful phrasing Silas had given her, that someone was looking into it. Owen went quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, a particular quality of quiet that she recognized, the sound of her brother deciding whether to ask the question forming in his mind or to accept the gift of not knowing. He accepted the gift. He told her to be careful. She told him she would. She ended the call. The room settled around the silence. She set her phone on the arm of the chair and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at Silas, who had not moved or spoken for the full 4 minutes and 11 seconds and who was watching her now with an expression she had begun, reluctantly, with full awareness of the implications, to be able to read. It was the expression he wore when he had made a decision and was now simply occupying the space of its aftermath. Settled. Present. Waiting without impatience, which was its own particular quality, patience with no performance in it. "Thank you," he said. She hadn't expected that. She blinked. "For what?" "For trusting me with enough of it." He stood, and the movement had that characteristic unhurriedness that she was becoming, against all professional wisdom, accustomed to. He moved toward the door, not the main door she had come through but the one on the study's north wall that she knew, from her Monday mornings, connected through a short corridor to the estate's formal dining room. "Come. Where are we going?" He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "You haven't eaten." She stared at him. I'm fine, I don't need." "It wasn't a question about your needs." He opened the door. The corridor beyond it was lit warmly, the smell of something that had been cooking reaching her even from here, something low and slow and complex, the kind of smell that belonged to a kitchen that had been attended to, not abandoned. It was an observation about the time. "It's past 9. Come." She came. She was beginning to understand that this was going to be a recurring feature of her evening. The dining room was not the room she would have predicted. She had cleaned it, of course, had run the cloth along the long mahogany table that seated 14, had straightened the chairs that were never pulled out, had replaced the dried arrangement at the room's center twice since October. The formal dining room of the Grimshaw estate was a room designed to impress, all dark wood and tall windows and the particular gravity of a space that knew its own consequence. That was not where he took her. The corridor branched, and he took the shorter turn, and the room they arrived in was something she had encountered only in passing, a smaller space off the main kitchen that she had always assumed was a secondary pantry or a staff eating area of some kind, because the door was always closed and she had not been asked to clean it. It was neither. It was a room with a round table that seated 4, a low hanging light above it that threw a warm and human circle of illumination, bookshelves on 2 walls that were organized with the same reed-worn carelessness as the study, and a window that looked out onto the kitchen garden where nothing was growing yet because it was the wrong season but the beds were clearly tended. It was, she realized with a disorientation that took a moment to resolve, a room where someone actually lived. He went to the range without ceremony and lifted the lid from a pot that had been sitting on the lowest heat setting, and the smell that had reached her in the corridor arrived in full now, something with red wine and herbs and the deep, settled quality of food that had been given time. He found 2 bowls in a cabinet above the counter with the ease of someone who knew where they were kept not because a housekeeper had organized them but because he had put them there himself. She stood inside the doorway and tried to reconcile what she was seeing with the architecture of the man she thought she had spent a year cataloging. "You cook," she said. "Occasionally." He ladled into the first bowl. "When I want something done a particular way. Mrs. Dallow has a full kitchen staff roster." "I'm aware. I hired them." He set the first bowl on the table. He was doing this with his back partially to her, which she was increasingly certain was deliberate, reducing the intensity of his attention by degrees, offering her the room to breathe. There's a difference between having staff who cook and cooking because you want to be somewhere quiet for an hour. He glanced back. "Sit down, Miss Finch. The chair won't argue with you." She sat. The silk of the dress whispered against the chair. The bowl in front of her was a bourguignon of some kind, dark, glossy, with the sheen of something properly reduced, and beside it he placed a piece of bread that had clearly been made that day, the crust catching the light in the way of something genuine. He sat across from her with his own bowl and poured 2 glasses of wine from a bottle already open on the table, and set one in front of her, and then he picked up his spoon and began to eat with the complete and unself-conscious ease of a man in his own kitchen, and something about the ordinariness of the gesture, the utter lack of performance in it, disassembled a small but load-bearing piece of the version of him she had constructed. She picked up her spoon. The food was extraordinary. She hadn't expected that either, though in retrospect she should have. This was a man who did nothing casually, who applied the same precise intention to everything within his reach. The wine was dark and unhurried. The bread was still faintly warm. The light above the table was the color of late evenings in rooms where people were comfortable with one another, and she was very carefully not thinking about the fact that she was not supposed to be comfortable. "Your father," he said, without preamble but without aggression. "How long ago?" She looked up. 3 years. He nodded. Not with sympathy exactly. Sympathy was not a register she associated with him, but with the particular gravity of someone who understood loss as a structural event, something that changed the load-bearing walls of a life and required significant internal reconstruction. "And Owen has been managing the debt since." "Owen has been trying to manage it." "I've been managing Owen." She said it before she could modulate it, the truth of the last 3 years compressed into a sentence. She expected to feel exposed by it. She felt, oddly, something closer to relief. He looked at her across the round table in the warm circle of the low light. "You've been doing that from inside my house," he said. Not an accusation. A realization, voiced aloud, with something underneath it she needed more than 1 glass of wine to correctly identify. "Yes. While pressing my shirts. Among other things." Something moved in his expression that might, on a different face, have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't complete itself. She had the sense it was a long time since that particular expression had had regular use, but the possibility of it changed his face in a way that made her look at the wine glass instead, for somewhere neutral to rest her eyes. "You should have told me," he said. Quiet. No recrimination in it. Just the plain fact of it, set on the table between them like everything else tonight. Cards placed face up by a man who had decided that honesty, in this particular situation, served him better than its alternative. "You were my employer," she said. "You were the last person I could tell." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his wine glass slightly. Outside the kitchen garden window the night was full and dark and the estate was its usual arranged silence. "And now?" he asked. She looked at him across the bread and the wine and the extraordinary food and the bookshelves with their reed-worn spines and the small table that seated 4 but had, she was fairly certain, been set for 1 every night until tonight. She looked at the geometric ink in the open collar and the damp-dried hair and the expression on his face that had been, for the last hour, doing away with everything she thought she knew about the geography of this man. "I don't know what you are now," she said honestly. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. "No," he agreed, with a quietness that settled into the room like the last note of something. "But you're still here." She picked up her wine glass. She did not argue the point. Outside, the night pressed against the kitchen garden window and the low light held its warm circle over the table, and Lorelei Finch, who had spent 365 days learning to be invisible, sat in the one room in the Grimshaw estate where, it turned out, someone had always simply been living, and she let herself be seen. She did not know how long they sat at the table. Time in that room behaved differently, softened at the edges, declined to announce itself with the usual urgency. The wine went down slowly. The conversation moved in the unhurried way of conversations between people who have already said several important things and are now navigating the particular terrain that exists on the other side of honesty, where the usual social scaffolding has been removed and what remains is either deeply uncomfortable or something else entirely. With Silas she was finding, consistently something else entirely. He asked about her life before the estate with the focused, methodical interest of a man conducting research into something that mattered to him, which was both flattering and faintly alarming. She answered more than she intended to, about the flat she had shared with 2 other women in Peckham before the money ran out, about the 14 job applications, about the agency and Mrs. Dallow's 11-minute monologue. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without interruption, without the social performance of listening that most people substituted for the real thing. She asked him, once, about the books on the shelves. It was a safer subject than most of what the evening had offered, and she was genuinely curious. The titles were an eclectic and slightly surprising collection, history and philosophy sitting alongside what appeared to be several annotated volumes on architecture and at least 2 novels she recognized as notoriously difficult. He answered without deflection, which surprised her. He told her about the architecture volumes with something that was, in the context of his usual register, almost animated, a preference for brutalist structures that she wouldn't have predicted, a particular interest in how buildings managed the relationship between their public and private faces. She listened and thought that this was perhaps the least oblique thing he had ever said about himself, and filed it accordingly. By the time she became aware of the hour it was nearly 11, and the wine bottle was 2/3 empty, and the bowls had been cleared. He had done it himself, standing and taking them to the counter with the same unhurried competence he applied to everything, and she had stopped being surprised by this, and the room had settled into the particular quality of late evenings when the night outside is complete and the light inside is warm and the world beyond the window has temporarily ceased to make demands. She became aware, with a clarity that the wine made slower to arrive at but no less definite once it did, that she should leave. That the appropriate arc of this evening, already so far from any appropriate arc she could have predicted, pointed toward her standing, thanking him for the food, and returning to the 3rd-floor east wing and the narrow bed and the window that never caught the sun. That staying longer was a choice with implications she hadn't been asked to consent to. She set her glass down. "I should go up," she said. Silas looked at her. He had been resting one forearm on the table in the way of someone entirely comfortable in their own space, and the look he gave her now was the one she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was making a decision, efficiently and without visible deliberation, and was about to make her aware of it. "Come with me," he said. Silas, his name came out before she could stop it, unmediated, without the professional prefix she had used for a year. She saw him register it. She pressed on. "It's late. This evening has already been considerably more than I anticipated." "It has," he agreed, standing. "Come with me anyway." She followed him. She was keeping a running tally of the number of times this had happened tonight, and the number was not reassuring in terms of what it suggested about the structural integrity of her decision-making, but she followed him, back through the connecting corridor, back through the study where the lamp was still burning its amber circle across the desk. He did not stop there. He went to the cabinet on the west wall, tall, mahogany, fitted with a lock that she had dusted around but never seen opened, and produced a key from the pocket of his trousers and opened it. The interior was organized with the precise logic of a man who knew exactly where everything was and would notice immediately if anything moved. She registered this in her peripheral awareness because what occupied her primary attention was what he was removing from the lower shelf, a manila folder, slender, with a label she couldn't read from where she stood. He set it on the desk. He opened it. She recognized the document inside immediately. Her employment contract, typed on agency letterhead, with Mrs. Dallow's signature and her own at the bottom in the blue ink she had used on the morning she arrived. She recognized the date. She had been 23. The number 42,000 had already existed but had not yet developed its current urgency. She looked from the document to Silas. He picked it up. He looked at it for a moment, not reading it, she thought, because he already knew what it said. Looking at it the way you looked at something you had already decided about, giving it the courtesy of a moment's acknowledgement before the conclusion. Then he took it in both hands and tore it in half. The sound it made in the quiet room was very clean. He placed both halves on the desk and tore them again, and set the 4 pieces down with a finality that was almost gentle, and looked at her. The silence lasted 4 seconds. "What," she said carefully, "have you just done?" "Something I should have done differently from the beginning." His voice was even. "You don't work for me, Miss Finch. As of tonight." She stared at the 4 pieces of paper on the desk. Some part of her brain was conducting a rapid and somewhat panicked audit of her financial situation, the savings, the notebook number, the 42,000 that was not yet 42,000, and finding it inconclusive and alarming. "You can't simply, there are legal. I'll have my solicitor contact the agency in the morning. You'll be compensated for the remainder of your contract term in full." He said it in the tone of someone resolving a logistical detail. "That's not the conversation I'm having with you." "Then what conversation are you having with me?" He looked at her steadily. "The one about why I tore it up." She waited. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She put them at her sides. "You came to this house because you needed money and you had no better options," he said. "You stayed because you are constitutionally incapable of doing anything less than completely and because leaving felt like failure when you hadn't yet solved the problem that drove you here. You have spent a year making yourself invisible in a house where you should not have had to be invisible." He paused. Each sentence arrived separately, given its own weight. "I am not willing to be the ongoing mechanism of that arrangement." The room felt very still. She stopped. Started again. "That's a considerable amount of information to have about someone you've never spoken to." "I told you," he said simply. "I noticed." She looked at the torn contract on the desk. At the 4 clean pieces of it, her name visible on 2 of them, the signature she had written at 23, full of the particular determination of someone who has already decided that dignity is a luxury and survival is the point. She thought about the 11-minute monologue. The kitchen annex. The window that faced the courtyard. 365 days of making herself water. "And now?" she asked. The same question she had asked at the table, over the wine and the extraordinary food. She was beginning to understand it was the only question the evening had, asked and re-asked as the ground kept shifting underneath it. Something moved in his face. "Now you're a guest in this house rather than an employee." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp threw its amber light across the desk and the torn pieces of paper and the careful, certain architecture of his expression. "And if I want to leave?" she asked. Quiet. Not combative. A genuine question, offered into the space between them to see what it displaced. He held her gaze. And there it was, the thing she had been peripherally aware of all evening, the thing underneath the dinner and the wine and the demolished contract and the considered, deliberate care with which he had managed every moment of the last several hours. It surfaced now, not loudly, not with any of the aggressive theater that men with less self-possession might have used. It surfaced the way everything with Silas surfaced, quietly, completely, with the unhurried certainty of something that had been true for longer than tonight. "I think you know the answer to that," he said. She did. That was the problem. She had known it from the moment he stepped into the warmth of the hallway lights and looked at her with the eyes of a man who had no intention of letting go. She had known it, and she was standing here anyway, not because she had no choice, and they both understood this, but because somewhere in the machinery of the last several hours a different kind of arithmetic had begun, one that her pale blue notebook had no column for. She looked at the torn contract. She looked at the man who had torn it. She looked at the door, which was right there, which had always been right there, and then she looked back at him. "Guessed," she said finally. Testing the word. Examining its architecture. "Yes," he said. The quiet certainty of it. "And tomorrow?" He moved then, not toward the door, not toward the desk. Toward her, closing half the distance between them with an unhurriedness that her pulse did not respond to calmly, and stopped there. Close enough that she could see the gray in his eyes with the clarity that the lamplight afforded. Close enough that she could smell the wine and the cedar of whatever he wore, and underneath that something that was simply, specifically, him. "Tomorrow," he said, "is still several hours away." She looked up at him from the small distance that remained. The torn pieces of her contract lay on the desk behind him. The amber light held the room in its warm circle. The estate was silent all the way to its edges. "You should know," she said, with what she felt was admirable steadiness given the circumstances, "that I'm very difficult to manage." The possibility of a smile moved across his face again. This time it arrived slightly further before stopping. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you be difficult to manage for 12 months. She pressed her lips together against something that was dangerously close to a smile of her own. She looked at the room, the bookshelves, the amber lamp, the desk with its torn paper, the man in front of her who had, over the course of one evening, dismantled every assumption she had carried about the geography of this house and her place within it. "Good night, Silas," she said. She walked to the door. She opened it. She felt his gaze follow her all the way across the room with the complete and patient attention of a man who understood that some distances were closed slowly, deliberately, at a pace that respected the nature of what was being crossed. She did not look back. But her hand, as it closed the door softly behind her, was not entirely steady. And the 40 feet of marble corridor between the study and the main staircase felt, tonight, like entirely different ground than it had this morning, as though the house itself had shifted slightly on its foundations, rearranged itself around a new and as yet unnamed center of gravity. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long time in the dark, in the crimson dress, with her hands in her lap and her heart doing something it had not done in 365 days of careful, deliberate smallness. Making noise. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long time, and then she lay down on top of the covers still in the dress because taking it off felt like a concession to an ending she wasn't ready to ratify, and she stared at the ceiling of the 3rd floor East Wing room that had been her entire private world for 12 months and found it completely insufficient. The ceiling had not changed. The window still faced the courtyard that never caught the sun. The room was still exactly the room it had always been, functional, impersonal, the spatial equivalent of the sensible wool she wore to disappear in. She was not the same person who had lived in it this morning. That was the problem. She could feel the difference in the way she occupied herself. Some internal arrangement had shifted, some load-bearing assumption about what was and wasn't available to her had been quietly removed while she was sitting at a round table in a room she hadn't known existed, eating food that someone had made with intention, being looked at by a man who had apparently been seeing her for 12 months while she perfected the art of not being seen. At midnight she sat up. She told herself she was going to the kitchen for water. She told herself this with the specific focus of someone who has decided that the stated reason is the only reason and will not be examining any others. She unzipped the dress because it was not practical sleeping attire, and put on the robe that hung on the back of the door, dark gray, the kind of robe that came with the room and asked nothing of anyone. She looked at herself briefly in the small mirror above the dresser. Dark eyes. Full bangs. The sharp line of her jaw and the high cheekbones that the dress had made architectural and that the robe now simply allowed to exist without comment. She went downstairs. The estate was very quiet. Not the arranged silence of daytime hours when the staff moved through it like a careful choreography, but the total quiet of a house at rest, every surface and corridor released from the performance of itself. The marble hallway was silver dark, the security lights outside casting their thin geometry through the tall windows. She moved through it without turning on a light because she knew every floorboard, every corner, every place where the old house settled into itself. She had been its shadow for a year. She knew its body better than anyone. She did not go to the kitchen. She was in front of the study door before she had completed the honest portion of her accounting, which was that she had known she was going here from the moment she stood up from the narrow bed. The door was not fully closed. A thin line of amber light showed at its edge, the desk lamp, still burning. It was nearly 1 a.m. She pushed the door open. Silas was at the desk. Not working. She registered this before anything else, the specific quality of his stillness that was different from his working stillness, which she had observed occasionally through the study door over 12 months and which had a forward, focus quality to it. This was something else. He was sitting with one forearm on the desk and his eyes on the middle distance, and the glass at his right hand looked like it had been there for a while. He had not changed. The white shirt still open at the collar, the sleeves still pushed to the elbows, the ink on his forearms catching the lamplight. He looked up when she pushed the door open. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I was going to the kitchen," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't say anything else. He simply looked at her across the room with the dark gray eyes that had been, this evening, doing progressive and significant damage to her composure, and waited. This was, she had learned tonight, what he did. He made space and waited in it with the patience of someone who had long since stopped confusing urgency with importance, and he let the thing that was going to happen simply arrive at its own pace. She crossed the room. She stopped on her side of the desk. That was as far as she had planned, that was the extent of the honesty she had permitted herself on the stairs. But the desk was between them and the lamp was throwing its amber circle and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the hallway, in the corridor, across the dinner table, across every charged distance the evening had constructed and then methodically closed, and she understood with a clarity that was not comfortable but was absolutely definite that there was no version of this moment that ended with the desk still between them. She walked around it. He turned in his chair as she came around the edge, turning to face her, and then he stood, in that unhurried way of his, unfolding to his full height with a slowness that had nothing in it of hesitation and everything in it of deliberateness. She stopped when there was perhaps 2 feet of space between them and looked up at him. She had been aware of the height differential all evening, had felt it in the hallway and in the study and at the table, but here, now, in the amber dark with the house entirely still around them, it landed differently. Not as a power imbalance. As a simple fact about the shape of things. He lifted his hand. Slowly. With the consideration of a man who understood that speed was not the point here, that the point was something else, the full acknowledgement of what was happening, each increment of it. His knuckles touched the line of her jaw, barely, the lightest possible contact, and stopped there. His thumb rested at the corner of her mouth without pressure. His eyes stayed on hers with an attention so complete that she felt it as something physical, as gravity, as the particular weight of being the only thing in someone's field of awareness. "Tell me to stop," he said quietly. She looked at him. At the gray eyes and the salt and pepper temples and the geometric ink in the open collar and everything underneath it, the man in the kitchen making food for one, the books with their broken spines, the torn contract on the desk behind her, the 12 months of being seen by someone she had never once allowed herself to look at directly because looking would have required acknowledging what she saw. "No," she said. He kissed her with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, not tentative, not rushed, but fully present in the way that only people who have decided something completely can be fully present. His hand moved from her jaw to the back of her neck, into the place where her ponytail began, and the contact of it was so specific and so certain that she made a sound she hadn't planned and felt him absorb it, felt his other hand come to her waist and draw her forward into the space she had been navigating toward all evening. She had her hands against his chest. She could feel his heart. It was not, she noted with a satisfaction she couldn't entirely explain, as steady as his exterior suggested. He pulled back enough to look at her. His hand was still at the back of her neck, his thumb at the edge of her jaw, and his eyes in the lamplight were doing something so unguarded that she felt the intimacy of it as its own thing, separate from the physical, the specific exposure of a very controlled man at the moment his control becomes irrelevant to him. "You were going to leave tonight," he said. Not an accusation. Just the fact of it, held between them. "Yes," she said. "You're not leaving." The quietness of it. The absolute, unperformed certainty. Not a question. Not a request. The clean declarative of a man who had made a decision that had the character of something permanent. She looked at him. She thought about the pale blue notebook in the wardrobe upstairs and the numbers she had written and crossed out and rewritten, and the door she had been moving toward for 365 days, and the cold brass handle, and the night outside that had been waiting. She thought about all the careful, deliberate arithmetic of the last year and the way it had been conducting itself in the background of this evening like a sum that no longer came out to the same answer. "I know," she said. He kissed her again, and this time there was less of the deliberate and more of the inevitable, and she stopped thinking about arithmetic entirely. His hands knew what they were doing with the unhurried competence he brought to everything, and the amber lamp threw its circle across the study floor, and the estate was silent in every direction, and the robe was dark gray and practical and not at all what she had planned to be wearing when this eventually happened. She had, in some peripheral chamber of her imagination that she had never officially acknowledged, assumed the red dress would still be involved. But the red dress had already done its work. It had been doing it since the moment she stepped into it upstairs, since she turned and saw herself in the mirror and recognized the woman looking back, since she walked down the stairs with her purse and her heart and her one act of deliberate visibility and found him standing in the hallway as though he had been waiting there for considerably longer than tonight. The dress had made her visible. What happened in the amber-lit study at 1 in the morning was something else, something that required no silk, no particular cut, no expensive perfume or high slit or architectural neckline. What happened was simpler and more total than any of that. He saw her. She let herself be seen. And the distance that had existed between them for 365 days, maintained with such careful and mutual and exhausting precision, closed itself at last with the absolute finality of a door that had no intention of opening again. Outside, the estate held its deep silence. The security lights cast their thin geometry through the tall windows. The marble hallway sat empty and silver dark, the brass handle cold on the front door that she had almost reached, in a different life that had ended sometime between the hallway and the study and the round table and the torn contract and the amber lamp that burned on into the small hours of a night that had rearranged everything. She did not think about the door again. She was in the kitchen when it happened. Not the kitchen annex where staff took their meals. She had not gone back there, had not been able to locate the version of herself that belonged in that room after the night that had preceded this morning. She was in the main kitchen, the one with the 6-burner range and the copper pots and the long marble counter where Mrs. Dallow coordinated the daily running of the estate's appetite. She was making tea because it was 7:43 in the morning and the house had begun its daily choreography around her and she was standing inside it differently than she had ever stood inside it before, not as one of its moving parts but as something the choreography arranged itself around. She was still working out how to hold that. Silas had been gone when she woke. The study had been morning-lit and empty, the desk lamp finally off, the torn pieces of her contract still on the desk surface where he had left them with the considered permanence of a statement he had no interest in retracting. There had been no note. She had not expected one. Notes were the communication of men who were uncertain about what they had done, who needed the buffer of paper and distance to manage the morning after a decision. Silas was not that. She understood this about him with a certainty that was new and surprisingly solid. She was pouring water into the pot when she heard the gate. Not the front entrance, the main gate with its intercom and its camera and the buzzer that rang at the security panel in the hallway. The service entrance, around the east side of the estate, which she knew from 12 months of receiving deliveries on Tuesday and Friday mornings. She knew its sound, the specific clang of its latch, the way the hinges announced themselves. She had never heard it on a Saturday at 7:43. She set the kettle down. The knock that followed was not a delivery knock. She had a taxonomy of knocks developed over a year of answering the service entrance, and this one was in a category she had no prior entry for, too deliberate for urgency, too irregular for professionalism, the knock of someone who was controlling the force of it with effort, which meant the natural force they were containing was considerable. She did not go to the door. She went instead to the hallway, where Graves, the head of the estate's security, a compact, quiet man she had exchanged perhaps 30 words with over the course of a year, was already moving toward the panel with his phone at his ear. He glanced at her without breaking stride, and something in the glance told her that whatever was at the service entrance was not unknown to him and was not welcome. "Stay inside," he said. The first directive he had ever given her directly. She stayed inside. She stood in the hallway and listened to the estate respond. She could feel it, almost, the way a body responds to threat, the sudden purposefulness of its systems. A second figure crossed the upper landing. The panel in the hallway chimed once. Graves spoke into his phone in a low, rapid voice she couldn't fully parse. Then the front door opened, and Silas came through it. He had been outside already. She processed this in fragments, the slight damp at his shoulders from the morning air, the dark coat that meant he had been somewhere beyond the estate's perimeter, the phone already in his hand and his face carrying the expression she had not seen before tonight but recognized immediately as the version of him she had been peripherally aware of all year without ever being close enough to read directly. The controlled power at its fullest extension. No softness in it anywhere. Not the man who had cooked at the range or turned a wine glass in his fingers or kissed her with his thumb at the corner of her mouth. Someone older and more absolute, who had made the acquaintance of consequences long before she was a factor in any of them. His eyes found her immediately. She watched some interior calculation resolve itself in his face. "Go upstairs," he said. "Who is it?" "Lorelei." Her name, without prefix. The way he'd said it last night at the desk, but the register entirely different now, not the intimacy of the study but the focused authority of a man managing a situation in which she was a variable he needed accounted for. "Upstairs. Second floor, east drawing room. Close the door." "Is it someone from Carver?" Something moved in his jaw. She had given him information last night, she understood now, that he had already possessed in a different form. She had given him the shape of Owen's entanglement and he had recognized it from the inside, from the position of a man who knew Carver's operations not as a victim of them but as a parallel force, someone who existed in the same geography of power and whose estate was, apparently, not as unknown to those operations as she had spent a year assuming. "Yes," he said. One word. "Clean." "Then I'm not going upstairs." She kept her voice level. She watched him absorb this in the way he absorbed everything, without visible disruption, processing it into the situation's parameters with an efficiency that would have been impressive if she were not the subject of it. "If this is about Owen, I need to know what's said." 3 seconds. He looked at her with the complete attention that had been, across the span of one evening, the most consistently disorienting thing about him. Then he turned to Graves. "Bring him to the south sitting room. Not the study." He looked back at her. "Stay behind me and do not speak unless I ask you to directly. Are we clear?" She nodded. He held her gaze for one additional second that had nothing professional in it and everything personal, a compression of the previous night into a single look, an acknowledgement of what existed between them and the fact that it was real enough to be protected, which was the most he could offer in the current geography of the moment. Then he turned and moved toward the south wing with the unhurried authority of a man in complete command of his own territory, and she followed. The south sitting room was a room she had dusted and not thought about, formal, underused, with high windows and pale furniture and the quality of a room maintained for occasions rather than habitation. 2 of Graves' people were already positioned at its edges, visible enough to constitute a statement and still enough to constitute a threat. They did not look at her. They did not look at anything except the door. The man they brought in was not what she had expected. She had constructed, from Owen's careful and incomplete descriptions, something more archetypal, the blunt instrument of organized intimidation, the broad and unsubtle emissary of men who used physical presence as their primary vocabulary. The man who came through the door under Graves' escort was perhaps 40, slight, with a quality of careful tidiness about him that was more unsettling than any amount of physical bulk would have been. He wore a gray suit. He carried a thin leather folder. He looked like a solicitor, and she understood immediately that this was the point. He stopped when he saw Silas. Something reorganized itself rapidly in his expression. Mr. Grimshaw, he said. He had the voice of someone who had prepared for a different room than this one. We weren't aware that Miss Finch had a connection to this estate beyond her employment. Now you are, Silas said. He had not moved to sit. He stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and the dark coat still on, and the quality of his stillness in this register was something she was understanding for the first time with her full attention, the specific gravity of a man in whose presence other men recalibrated. She watched it happen in real time. The solicitor-shaped man with his leather folder and his gray suit was performing a rapid and visible internal revision of his position. The matter with Mr. Finch, the man began carefully, is a private financial arrangement. We're simply here to discuss. You're here, Silas said, with a quietness that lowered the temperature of the room by several degrees, because someone sent you to collect documentation from a drop point that has been used to establish a pattern of dependency. You're here to make clear to Miss Finch that her brother's situation is more permanent than he has understood it to be. He paused. Each sentence had the quality of something measured out with precision, not a word in excess of what was required. You're here because Carver believed that accessing her would be straightforward. The man said nothing. His folder was very still in his hands. It isn't, Silas said. The two words sat in the room with the absolute completeness of a door being closed. She felt them in her sternum. She watched the gray-suited man feel them somewhere similar and less easily managed. The debt, Silas continued, is being settled in full. Today. You'll receive confirmation through the appropriate channels before this evening. In exchange, Owen Finch's name and his sister's are removed from every document, every record, every outstanding obligation in Carver's organization. Permanently. He let that sit for a moment. Carver will understand that this is not a negotiation. It is an account of what is going to happen. The man looked at Silas for a long moment. She could see him assessing, measuring, running the arithmetic of the situation with the rapid competence of someone whose profession was exactly this kind of arithmetic. She watched him reach the conclusion she had already reached, that there was no available counterposition. That the room and the man at its center and the people at its edges had already foreclosed every alternative. I'll need to make a call, the gray-suited man said. Use the hallway, Graves said, from the door. He was escorted out. The room held the three of them, Silas, Lorelei, and Graves, who moved to the window and looked out with the practiced non-presence of a professional who understood when a room needed to contract around fewer people. She looked at Silas. At the dark coat and the absolute composure and the man who had just dismantled in 90 seconds the weight she had been carrying for 3 years. The debt, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. That's £42,000. I know what it is. Silas. It's done. He looked at her with the dark gray eyes that could be so many things, and right now they were the particular thing she had no word for except perhaps the plainest one, certain. Certain of her. Certain of what the previous night had established between them and what it meant for every calculation that followed. It was done the moment you told me Owen's name. She looked at him for a long time. The pale blue notebook in the wardrobe upstairs. The number written and crossed out and rewritten. The 3 years of arithmetic. Done. She did not cry. She was not built for that kind of release in front of people, had dismantled that particular mechanism sometime in the first year after her father died and had not fully reconstructed it since. But something shifted in her face that she couldn't control and didn't try to, something that was the nearest available approximation of what 42,000 pounds of weight felt like when it was lifted all at once, without warning, by a man in a dark coat who looked at her like she was the fixed point everything else organized itself around. Why? She asked. The same question underneath every question the evening had asked. He looked at her across the pale formal room, with Graves at the window and the gray-suited man making his call in the hallway and the estate arranged in its careful silence all the way to its edges. Because, he said, with the quietness that was his most honest register, you are not a problem to be managed from a distance anymore. 3 weeks passed before she moved her things from the 3rd floor. Not because she was uncertain. She had passed the threshold of uncertainty somewhere between the study and the round table and the amber lamp burning into the small hours, and she had not found her way back to it. But there was a difference between knowing something and inhabiting it fully, between a door closing and being willing to turn around and face the room it had closed you into. She needed the 3 weeks. Silas did not rush her. He was constitutionally incapable of rushing anything, and he treated with the particular patience of someone who understood that the thing being given time was worth the wait. She moved her things on a Tuesday. The pale blue notebook went into the drawer of the writing desk in the room that was now hers, a room on the 1st floor with tall windows that caught the morning light from the south, which was so far from the 3rd floor east wing and its courtyard-facing shadow that the distance felt geographical. She did not throw the notebook away. It had been too many things to her for too long to be simply discarded, and besides, the numbers in it told a story she intended to remember, not as a wound but as a coordinate, the fixed point from which the distance traveled could be accurately measured. The number on its last page was 42,000. Crossed out once. Not rewritten. She called Owen the morning after Graves confirmed the debt settlement through whatever channel Silas's world used for such confirmations. Owen picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been awake. She told him it was done. He was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line, the particular quality of silence that belonged to people who had been bracing against something for so long that the removal of it took a moment to register as real, as though the body needed time to believe that the weight it had been compensating for was actually gone. He asked how. She told him a version of the truth that was accurate and incomplete in the proportions she had become practiced at. He asked if she was safe. She said yes, and meant it in a way she had not meant anything in 3 years, the word carrying its full weight for once instead of the partial, provisional weight she had been giving it. He told her he loved her. She told him the same. She hung up the phone and stood in the 1st floor room with the south-facing windows and the morning light coming through them, and she was very still for a long time, and she did not cry, but it was a closer thing than it had been in the south sitting room 3 weeks ago. The estate rearranged itself around her with a naturalness that she found, in quiet moments, almost alarming. She had expected friction, from Mrs. Dallow, from the staff who had worked alongside her, from the daily choreography of a household that had organized itself around her invisibility for 12 months and would presumably require some adjustment to accommodate her new geometry. There was less of it than she anticipated. Mrs. Dallow received whatever communications Silas had delivered on the subject with the expression of someone confirming a thing they had suspected for longer than they would admit, and adapted her arrangements accordingly with the seamless efficiency that made her excellent at her work. The staff were more varied. A few of the longer-tenured ones treated her with a careful, recalibrated courtesy that had replaced the collegial ease of the kitchen annex. She was no longer one of them, and they were navigating the new topology with professionalism if not warmth. 2 of the younger ones, women who had been friendly in the passing way of people who share adjacent schedules, offered something closer to genuine welcome once it became clear that she was neither performing a temporary arrangement nor inclined to manage anyone. She was not Mrs. Dallow and had no intention of becoming her. She was something the estate had not had before and did not yet have a category for, and she found that she was more comfortable in that uncategorized space than she would have predicted. She was, after all, practiced at occupying spaces that had no existing framework for her. What she was not practiced at was the table. The formal dining room, the long mahogany one with the 14 chairs and the arrangement she had replaced twice and the high windows and the considerable gravity of a space that knew its consequence, had remained, through all the weeks of adjustment, a room she passed through rather than occupied. She had continued to eat in the small kitchen room with the round table and the bookshelves, because it was where she and Silas had established the habit of evenings, and habits established in the hours between 9 and midnight in an amber-lit room had a particular adhesive quality that she had no interest in challenging. But habits were not the same as positions. And Silas, who was deliberate about everything, had been deliberately patient about this one. It happened on a Thursday. The same day of the week she had learned, in her first month, to associate with the low murmur of voices through the closed study door and the visitors who did not use the front entrance. She knew now what those Thursdays meant, had been learning the shape of Silas's world in the way she had always learned things, methodically and through careful observation, accumulating information with the patience of someone who understood that a complete picture was more useful than a partial one. The men who came on Thursdays were not criminals in any cinematic sense of the word. They were men of organized consequence, which was a different thing, more administrative, more concerned with the maintenance of arrangements than with the theatrics of power. They came with folders and phones and the careful vocabulary of people whose profession required them to be very precise about what was and wasn't said out loud. She had not attended a Thursday before. Silas had not asked her to. She had not offered. On this Thursday he came to find her in the library. She had claimed it, quietly, over the past weeks, in the way that she had always claimed spaces, through regular and purposeful presence, and he stood in the doorway with his jacket on and his phone in his hand and looked at her across the room with the dark gray eyes that had become, over the past 3 weeks, the fixed point of her daily geography. "Come," he said. She looked at him. She set down the book she had been reading, one of the architecture volumes. She had developed, she was finding, an actual interest in the relationship between public and private structures, which she suspected was not coincidental, and she looked at him for a moment with the full awareness of what the word meant in this context, in this doorway, on a Thursday. She came. The dining room was set differently than she had ever seen it. Not the full length of it, the far 9 chairs were not in use, the table's lower end existing tonight as pure mahogany architecture, polished and empty and ceremonial. The active portion was the head, set for 7, with the kind of quiet precision that meant Graves had overseen it. Crystal. Dark linen. The particular arrangement of objects on a table that communicated, without words, that this was not an ordinary dinner. 5 men were already seated, or in the process of it. She recognized 2 of them from Thursday silhouettes, voices she had catalogued through closed doors now attached to faces, which was disorienting in the specific way that abstract things became disorienting when they acquired concrete form. They looked at her with expressions she was practiced enough in reading to parse rapidly: assessment, recalibration, the rapid internal revision of a situation's parameters. The same revision she had watched the gray-suited man perform in the south sitting room, though directed differently, without threat and with something closer to the particular respect that powerful people extended to adjacency with other powerful people. Silas's hand was at the small of her back. Light, certain, the way all his contact was certain, not possessive in the way that required display but possessive in the way that required no display at all, the touch of a man who did not need to announce what was his because the fact of it was already legible in the room. He held the chair to his immediate right. She sat. The chair was not the one she had imagined, in the peripheral and unacknowledged way she had imagined things over the past weeks. She had assumed something further from the head, something with a little more of the spatial anonymity she was still occasionally reaching for out of 12 months of habit. The chair he held was not that. It was the one that communicated, to everyone at the table and to the room itself and to the considerable gravity of the space that knew its consequence, exactly what she was. Not staff. Not guest. Not a variable being managed from a distance. She settled into the dark linen and the crystal light and the quiet authority of the room, and she looked at the table, at the men recalibrating, at the empty expanse of mahogany below the active portion, at the high windows and the arranged silence of the estate beyond them, and she understood, with the complete and unambiguous clarity that she had always brought to things once she allowed herself to see them, that this was the room she would not be leaving. Not because she had no choice. She had learned, over 3 weeks and 1 night and 365 days, the precise difference between a cage and a choice. She had stood at the cold brass handle of the front door. She had let go of it herself. She had not been a shadow insensible wolf for 12 months, saving her money and making herself water, in order to end up in someone else's version of her life. She was here because this, the table, the room, the man to her left with his hand briefly resting on the back of her chair and his eyes finding hers for one private second before the evening required him elsewhere, this was the version she had chosen with her full attention, with every piece of information available to her, with the clear-eyed arithmetic of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and had stopped accepting less. The pale blue notebook in the upstairs drawer had one more number in it she had not yet written. She would write it tonight, when the Thursdays were finished and the house returned to itself and the small kitchen room with the round table was warm and lit and waiting. She would write it not as a target but as a record, the final entry in a ledger that had governed 3 years of her life and now, definitively, did not. She picked up her glass. Across the table, one of the men whose voice she had known before his face introduced himself with the careful courtesy of someone establishing a new coordinate. She responded with her name, not Miss Finch, not the title that had belonged to the third-floor East Wing and the kitchen annex and the sensible wool, just Lorelei, clean and unhurried, occupying its full 2 syllables the way she occupied the chair. The way she intended, from now on, to occupy every room she entered. Not as water finding the path of least resistance. Not as a shadow in the margin of someone else's light. As herself, specific, visible, and entirely, deliberately present. Silas's hand returned briefly to the back of her chair. She did not look at him. She did not need to. The contact said everything his register rarely put into words, that she was here, that this was real, that the distance that had existed between them for 366 days had closed with the permanence of something structural, something that had changed the load-bearing walls of the house itself and could not be undone without taking the whole architecture down. Outside, the estate held its arranged silence. Somewhere on the second floor, in a drawer of a writing desk in a room where the morning light came through the south-facing windows, a pale blue notebook sat with its last page open and its final number crossed out and not rewritten. She had stopped counting toward a door. She was, at last, somewhere worth staying. And just like that, the debt is cleared. The contract is torn. The chair at the head of the table is hers. And Lorelei Finch, who spent a whole year learning to be invisible, has decided, with her full chest, to be seen. But this is Silas Grimshaw's world. And worlds like his do not stay quiet for long. Every queen has a first test. And something tells me theirs is only just beginning to show its teeth. If this story pulled you in, if you felt the tension in that hallway, the weight of that crimson dress, the slow burn of 2 people circling each other for 366 days before everything finally gave way, then you already know what to do. Like this video. It tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be found by the people who need them. Subscribe to the channel. Because this is just one door, and behind every other one is a world that will keep you up past midnight and completely ruin your morning plans. And drop a comment below. Tell me, were you rooting for Lorelei the moment she refused to shrink in that hallway? Or did Silas have you from the moment he said her name for the very first time? Because I need to know which side of this you were on. And tell me if you want a part 2. Because that man just cleared £42,000 of debt without blinking, and I have a feeling he is not done making statements. The vault is open. The next story is waiting. Don't miss it.